Good afternoon and welcome. I'm Raji Pillai, and I welcome you all to this event on behalf of Indian business and professional women and Silicon Valley Reads. Please note that the event is being recorded, so you and others may enjoy it at a later time. So Indian Business and Professional Women was founded in 1994, and it's a nonprofit networking organization that mentors professional women. Silicon Valley Reads is also a nonprofit whose mission is to promote reading and literacy, broaden the exposure to and appreciation of good literature, and build a sense of strong community. Organized by the Santa Clara County Office of Education, the Santa Clara County Library, and the San Jose Public Library Foundation, each year Silicon Valley Reads schedules more than 150 events around the Bay Area in February and March for meaningful book discussions. IBPW has been collaborating with Silicon Valley Reads to host these discussions for 15 years. Our thanks to Deepka Lalwani, founder of IBPW, and Reed Myers, director of Silicon Valley Reads, for making this event possible. This event, of course, would not be possible without author Amanda Skenandore. Amanda comes from a family of die-hard scientists who always make room in their house for the arts. Amanda is a historical fiction writer and registered nurse. Her novel, Between Earth and Sky, won the American Library Association Reader's List Award for Best Historical Fiction. She grew up in the Colorado Rockies and now lives in Las Vegas with her husband and their pet turtle, Lenore. So her beautiful book, a few words about it. I imagine many, if not all of you have read it, but if there's anyone who hasn't, just a quick introduction. So the glamorous world of a silent film star's wife abruptly crumbles when she's exiled hundreds of miles from home, from Los Angeles, to be detained at the Carville lepers' home in Louisiana. This is a page-turning story of courage, resilience, and reinvention, and it's set in 1920s Los Angeles and Louisiana. It's based on the true story of continental America's only leper colony. The Second Life of Mirielle West brings vividly to life the Louisiana institution where thousands of people were stripped of their civil rights, branded as lepers, and forcibly quarantined throughout the entire 20th century. It is also a place where painstaking research led to a cure being found. It is my enormous pleasure to welcome Amanda Skenandore to the book event. A warm welcome to you, Amanda.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
Great pleasure. So let's jump right into it and start with the plot and setting. And actually, before I do that, let me tell the audience members, thank you all for joining again. And should you have questions for Amanda, please type them up in the chat and send them, and feel free to wait until we're about, halfway through, about 4:30, 4:35, or if you have a question you'd like to just ask, go ahead and put it in the chat, please. All right. So Amanda, tell us how you decided to write about leprosy, or Hansen's disease, as it is now called. You mentioned in the author's note at the end of the book that you read a book about Carville, and this sparked your interest. So tell us about your research into Carville.
Well, as you mentioned, it began with this little book I found at the library here in Las Vegas, a tiny little book called Carville, Remembering Leprosy in America. And I pulled it off the shelf, and I was struck kind of right away by leprosy in America. I had no idea that the disease had ever been endemic in the United States. So I take the book and I tuck myself away in a little corner of the library, and I read it front cover to the end, I should say. And again, I was struck by several things. One, that so much of what I thought I knew about leprosy was wrong, and how little I actually did know about the disease. But I think most of all, by the way that these people who had this disease in the 20th century and before, how they were treated, how there was such stigma surrounding the disease that they were rounded up and really exiled from the community and ripped apart from their families. And I thought, if I never knew about Carville or the fate of these people, maybe there were other people who also didn't know. And so that's why I decided to write this, the story. And so certainly, again, because I knew so little, there was a lot to research. And I began with learning about the disease so that I, had a true understanding, both of our knowledge about the disease today, but also because I knew I was writing the book in a time, before they had a cure. I wanted to make sure that I was representing the knowledge that they had in the 1920s so that that was accurate as well. And then very quickly, I found that there is a museum, a National Hansen's Disease Museum, and it's actually at Carville. Carville is no longer a leper colony and hospital, but the museum is still there, and several of the buildings that were in existence during this time are still standing. So I contacted the curator and was able to go and spend several days at the museum, seeing some of the exhibits and artifacts they have there, and really doing a lot of research in their archive so that I could get sort of this first person experience of what life was really like. I stayed in the infirmary. They have kind of sort of like a hostel there now, and was able to just sort of wander the grounds a little bit after the museum had closed. And it really gave me, I think, a much deeper perspective of what life would have been like for the people there at Carville. Even today, it's a remote part of Louisiana. It's not really that far from Baton Rouge or New Orleans, but still it feels isolated. And it really helped, I think, for me to imagine what life would have been like when I was there. And another part that you can see if anyone does ever go to visit, they have a little driving tour that you can take through the parts of the facility that remain, including the cemetery. And so I visited the cemetery, and that really, I think, brought home for me this idea that these are real people's lives and real people's experiences that I was, trying to convey. And it just made me aware of the responsibility of getting things as honest and correct as I could.
That's wonderful. And one thing you had mentioned once when we spoke earlier is that you actually had access to the menus of the dining hall, yes, and what they ate at the time.
Yeah, I was really interested in finding out the day-to-day life. So the curator at the museum was incredibly helpful, and found letters, found again old menus from the dining hall, different newsletters that the patients had sent out, treatment programs that they had done again before they had the cure. So it was a wealth of knowledge, and I think helped me balance. I had this idea before I began, that this would be sort of a doom and gloom story. I mean, how could it not be, right? We were rounding up people with a disease, shunning them from society, exiling them, imprisoning them, and essentially throwing away the key. But really what I found when I went to Carville and I read the stories of people there was a lot of hope that people retained, and a lot of joy that they found and meaning in their lives.
Mm-hmm. In the beginning of the book, it's set in Los Angeles, and it's filled with glamour and glitz, a movie star's life, galas and amazing events. So tell us why you chose Los Angeles as kind of one of the settings for your book.
Yeah. So during this time, the late 19th century, early 20th century, there were a handful of states where Hansen's disease, leprosy, was endemic. And I wanted to stay true to, that part of the history and, the disease prevalence. So California was one of them. And I knew that I wanted my heroine, I wanted Mirielle, to be far apart from her family when she goes to Carville, so that, the distance was something that was experienced by a lot of people who went to Carville, and I wanted to represent that. But there was also something sort of, in a way, sort of magical, right, about early Hollywood and the silent film era. But I think at the same time, similar to today, it was a very image-focused place. And here you have someone who now has this disease that is, again, shrouded in so much stigma and misunderstanding. And I wanted to sort of highlight that difference, so that when she does go to Carville, not only is it a place unlike anything she's ever ever been, but also that there's just so much at stake should her disease become known to the larger public.
Right. And, you know, we just watched the Academy Awards last weekend, and I was struck that in your book, in one of the letters that Mirielle's husband, Charlie, writes to her, he mentions this little meeting with some of the founders of, you know, the MGM, you know, the big movie companies, about the formation of the Academy of Motion Pictures. You know, so that was so cool that in the 1950s, 1930s, where this is set, is when the Academy formed. So that, you know, let's talk about the train journey, how she is kind of taken from LA and sent forcibly on a train to Louisiana. It's a nightmare come true. You know, she has no choice. She's forced into quarantine in a leper colony. And this is how it was with those who were diagnosed with leprosy in the early days before there was a cure. You know, the colony on Hawaii in Molokai is written about in James Michener's book, Hawaii, where a lot of people were just offloaded off the boats close to the shore, and they had to just make their way there because nobody wanted to even go to the island to safely kind of let them off. And there were and still are leper colonies in India and in other parts of the world. So were there other leper colonies in the US at the time, in addition to Carville?
As it began, so before Carville was sort of founded, most states had would just take people who had the disease and they would put them in like the pest house or the isolation ward of the county hospital. There was a colony off the coast of Massachusetts. There was another colony actually in Eastern Canada. But again, most places, there just wasn't a very high incidence so that they would just, again, put them in the pest house. And this is actually part of what led to the founding of Carville in Louisiana, which was another place where there was sustained spread of the disease. There was a newspaper article written in the 1890s about all of the patients who have leprosy who are in the pest house. And it created this stir, you know, in the community in New Orleans, and people were like, we don't want them anywhere near here, get them outside of the city limits. And so the state bought about 30 acres of land up along the Mississippi, literally right along the Mississippi, in between New Orleans and Baton Rouge. It was an old plantation with a big crumbling plantation house. And they told everyone in the neighborhood that they were buying this plantation to build an ostrich farm. And then in the cover of night, they got everyone who had leprosy onto this barge, and they boated them up the river and sort of dropped them off there at this old plantation. And the patients were living in the former slave cabins. There was no running water, no heat. And the conditions were pretty terrible. A couple years later, the Daughters of Charity decided that they would come and help these patients because the state was having a terrible time finding nurses who were willing to come and take care of these patients. And the Daughters of Charity said that they would. And they served there at Carville as not only nurses, but in the lab, in the pharmacy. They did administrative tasks, all sorts of things for over 100 years after that point. And so this was where it became what was known as the Louisiana Leper Home. And that was where everyone in Louisiana was sent. But again, anywhere else, people were just sort of put in little isolation wards. And then in the 19-teens, there was a man, his name was John Early. And he, like many people, when they found out that he had the disease, he was locked away, but he had a family to take care of. And so he would escape, run away with his family, be able to work and provide for them for a little bit of time. And then he would be taken again by the public health authorities and locked away again. And this happened several times. And he was put in really, again, just terrible conditions. One time he was isolated in this tent that was surrounded by this fence. And there was a soldier kind of on guard to make sure that he didn't escape. But eventually, again, he did escape. He went to Washington, D.C., and he booked a room at a very fancy hotel where a lot of legislators would often stay, people, who served in Congress. He stayed there for a couple of days, and then he called the press. And there on the steps of the hotel, he said, my name is John Early and I have leprosy. And he said, if the laws are going to say that people like me have to be isolated, have to be quarantined, then you have to take care of us when you do that. And because there were, again, legislators who stayed at this hotel, they were terrified that they might have caught the disease and terrified that there could be this person with the disease out and about among people, that they suddenly were like, okay, yeah, we better do this. And so they passed legislation to create a national leprosarium, and they chose the Louisiana leper home, Carville, as the location. And so then in the 1920s, it opened as the national site, and anyone in the country at the time was sent to live there. And again, sometimes it was for a little while, but oftentimes it was for their entire lives.
Wow. Yeah, what a story. I think you've set the stage for us, about the history of the disease, the history of the colonies in America. So let's talk a little bit about the characters. So Mirielle West is not an instantly likable heroine. She comes from great wealth. She has heirs. In fact, at the Silicon Valley Reads kickoff, where you and two other authors spoke with Sal Pizarro, Sal commented that he was pleased when bad things happened to Mirielle. So it brought to my mind some other women in literature. So, for example, in Gone with the Wind, everyone loves Melanie Wilkes, but many just hate Scarlett O'Hara. And yet, she was the driving force. She had passion, she had a mission, she wanted to hold on to her land. So talk to us a little bit about how your readers have reacted to Mirielle West. What reactions you've heard?
I've heard, I would say, a variety of reactions. I think that certainly some people definitely echo Sal's feeling, especially at the beginning, because as you mentioned, she's selfish and she's privileged and she's cold. But I think a lot of people, as they continue to read and they see that she is on this journey, and that's really why I created her in this way, because I wanted someone who would have this great change throughout the course of the novel. So I needed someone, who's not starting off at a high point in her life, and really does have to work for a life and work at becoming a better person. Certainly, as a reader myself, I enjoy finding those books where there is a character who has this sort of hard fought at change, because then to me it's like, well, Amanda, I can change too. Like we can do this. We can do these hard things. And ultimately too, I think the story in a lot of ways is about loss and recovering from loss. Not only, of course, there is in the story the loss of Muriel's freedom, but she's already facing a terrible loss at the very beginning of the book. And so I have a lot of, I would say, compassion for her, even at the outset, because she's certainly, she's not behaving in a way that is at all admirable. But she is grappling with something very difficult. And I think, we don't always deal with things in a way that are healthy for us, in a way that show us in our best lights all of the time. And I kind of wanted to be true to that side of loss and grief as well.
That absolutely. I mean, I think overnight she lost, pretty much everything, all contact with her family, her little children. And as you say, there was another loss that you talk about in the book that really makes us feel a great deal of compassion for Mirielle. And then, all this, all the stigma and, associated with the disease. So a little bit about the stigma. In India, Mother Teresa was revered for her efforts to overcome stigma against those with leprosy. She said, "The biggest disease today is not leprosy or tuberculosis, but rather the feeling of being unwanted." Mm-hmm. And you have made that same message come to life with your characters in the book, not just Mirielle and her struggles with, everyone suddenly being ostracized by the society that used to fawn over her, but many other characters who were kind of shunned by their families. So tell us about your learnings, from your research about how a diagnosis of leprosy for one family member affected the rest of the family and how the family reacted.
And that I think that's one of the harrowing things about this particular disease, in that in some ways the stigma is as bad as the disease itself, and not just for the person who experiences the disease, but also, as you mentioned, for their families. So I would read about instances where, someone had a family member and they were sent to Carville, but then word got out and that person's children were kicked out of school, or their family business had to close because no one would patronize them anymore, or some families that were entirely kicked out of town and had to go live somewhere else. And so at Carville, there was a great deal of care taken to sort of shield people's families on the outside. When people came to Carville, they took a new name, and the contact with their families a lot of times really was kept to a minimum, or in some cases kind of hidden. I've had a couple of people who have reached out to me who had family members at Carville, and a couple of them have said that they didn't even know until they were adults, even older adults, that particular family member, that uncle or that cousin actually had the disease, because it was just kept so quiet. And it's not, in part, of course, it's the fear, right? There's this sense of, leprosy, that you're almost like the walking dead, if you will, and then all this misinformation about, your limbs fall off and that sort of thing. But it also comes with this moral judgment, right? If you have the disease, it's because you deserve it. It's because you're unclean. It's because you're sinful. And that, I think, just adds to that stigma, to the weight of the stigma. And of course, those things aren't true. That we're just talking about a bacteria, right? But certainly at the time, and still a little bit today, that stigma still lingers.
Indeed. And, so a couple of the so many of the characters are so, they're just depicted so movingly, and they're so interesting. They have humor, they have, all sorts of interesting life experiences. They tell stories about their exploits outside. Some of them escape every now and then to go have a night on town. It's a fascinating set of people. So two of them, Frank and Hector, are other characters with whom Mirielle connects, and they show her great kindness, even in the midst of her struggles with her new predicament. By sharing their own difficulties and with their humor, they help her find hope. So I wondered, as you were writing this, and even today, who was the character, if there was just one, with whom you felt the most affinity?
I definitely felt a great affinity for Frank. Of all of the characters are creations of my own imagination. I did use certainly things that I had read about, experiences that real patients had. I would sort of chuck those into the story in the way that my characters might experience them. But of all of the characters, Frank is the most, I would closely based off of a real person. And even that's just a little bit. But there was a man at Carville, his name was Stanley Stein, and he came a little bit later. He came in the 1930s from New York. And he just refused to let the disease, and more importantly, I think the isolation and the quarantine, stop his life. And he was a huge force at the colony for creating a sense of community. So he started a theater troupe, and he started a newsletter, and this newsletter grew so that it wasn't just there at Carville, but they were sending these newsletters all over the world. And he really championed to get the disease, the name of the disease, changed from leprosy to Hansen's disease because of the great stigma that's associated with that word. And so he wrote a memoir called Alone No Longer that I read. And I was just, again, I was really moved by his sense of community, his sense of hope, and just his relentlessness. He ended up not too long after he was there, within that first decade that he was at Carville, he went blind. He never left Carville. He died there after several decades, but he lived an incredibly full life. And that was what I wanted to bring to Frank, and what I wanted Frank to be able to then, show Mirielle that is possible despite their circumstances.
He was certainly a very charming and wonderful character. So let's move on to a slightly different topic, which is, stigma, prejudice, and hope. So, we've recently experienced much fear of the unknown through the coronavirus pandemic. And during the early days, there was a lot of stigma, a lot of prejudice. And in some parts of society, there continue to be. Your book was just about written by the time the COVID-19 pandemic shutdown started. And you are a registered nurse. You work in infection control, infection prevention, and so this, I'm eager for you to share with the audience some of your experiences about that period in your life, both as a writer and also as a registered nurse, when COVID cases started mounting.
I think it was certainly for all of us a harrowing time, especially in those first, the first months. But I will say that writing this book, I was just finishing the book as the pandemic began. So the book was due to my editor May 1st of 2020. And of course, everything really started to happen here earlier in the early winter, and it's starting in, March. And as you mentioned, I'm a nurse. I work at a hospital here in Las Vegas. I work part-time, and then I write, the rest of the time. But of course, when the pandemic began, I was working 40, 50 hours a week because there was such need. And those days were so that there was so much fear and not, there's so much that we didn't know, and so much that was changing day to day. That was one of the things as an infection preventionist at the hospital that I did, was trying to just stay up on what is the CDC saying today? What is the latest recommendation, and how can we make use of the limited, PPE that we have, and how do we get more, and what do we do when we run out? Like all of these questions. So I would, spend my day working on these things, and then come home, and I still had this book that I had to finish so that I could get it to my editor. And so I would, work on that in a little bit in the evenings every night. And I found in a sort of fortuitous way that it gave me a lot of perspective, that, I thought, okay, we are going through an unprecedented moment, certainly unprecedented in our lives. And we are quarantined as well. And there is so much fear and unknown. But I thought back to the people who I had read about, the real life people at Carville and their experiences. And again, how they not only survived, but they thrived. They found meaning, they found love and friendships, and they endured. And I really thought, okay, if they could do that under these circumstances, we can too. Like, we are going to be okay. And it was really something that I hoped that the book would be able to share with readers when it came out, because, we were still a little bit, in the pandemic at that point, that there is hope, even when it just feels like you are overwhelmed with change, with uncertainty, that if we just continue to stick together, rely on one another, support one another, that we can make it through.
That's wonderful. And I think I would be remiss in not thanking you, not only for your beautiful book, but for your work during that time, you and your colleagues worldwide that kept the rest of us, alive and healthy. Many of us didn't make it, but I think many of us did because of the hours that you and your colleagues spent. So thank you.
Thank you. I will say it was an honor. It was an absolute honor to be a nurse in this time.
Yeah, an amazing time. And also, your editor must have been pleased that the book was mostly done by the time this came around. So now, one of the things that struck me about the book is that while racial segregation was very much a reality in the 1930s, pre-Civil War and everything, yet you write of people of different races living together at Carville. Black people, white people, people of Mexican origin. Tell us more about racial integration at Carville in this, unusual environment.
Yeah, and that's of course something that's not unique to this disease, but many diseases, right? Like they don't discriminate. And so you had people at Carville from many different races, different ethnicities, different socioeconomic strata. That was another reason I wanted to, have Mirielle. She comes from this sort of high economic, class. She's very wealthy, but you had people from every strata that were there. And we were all together just sort of facing something, living a shared experience that was very, very unique. And in some ways, I think that it allowed for people to create connections with other people that they might not have in the outside. At the same time, it was not enough to erase, the prejudice that people brought with them. And during the 1920s, I got maps when I was at the museum and the archive, and so I can see like they were segregated in terms of housing. There were cottages that were labeled, this was for the Black men and this was for the white men's cottages, and these were for the Black women and the white women's cottages, and so they were separated in that way. But they weren't segregated, for example, like in the dining hall. They weren't segregated in the infirmary, when you would see that in many other hospitals where you would have separate wards for the different people of different races. And uniquely, they weren't segregated at school. So Carville had this tiny, like one-room schoolhouse where the children who were at Carville would go to study, to learn, to read and write. And the curator at the museum, she mentioned to me when I was there, she says she thinks that was probably the first school in all of the South to be integrated, because as far back as the 1920s, the children were learning side by side there.
That is fascinating. Yeah, I think in one of the scenes, I'll call it, because it's so visual, your book, there's people are playing out on the meadow, and there's little children, of various races running around and playing together, which struck me as unusual. So yeah, thank you for speaking about that. So in some parts of the world, due to inadequate screening, so for example, the World Health Organization at some point decided that, we're good, leprosy is under control. We don't need to have these active information campaigns. And at that point, a lot of awareness kind of dropped due to lack of funding, etc. So leprosy prevails in some parts of the world. There are many colonies and communities where the stigma persists, and families abandon their affected members to these colonies. So even today, there are parts of India where one might see how life was at Carville decades ago, where the thing is, if it's diagnosed early enough, it can be cured. So, what would you like to see worldwide, as a medical professional, to address the continuing prevalence of leprosy and the stigma around it?
I think one of the things that you touched on, that it's not enough to address the disease, that we have to address the stigma as well. And we have to do that through education, so that, again, so that people understand this isn't this isn't something that someone gets because they're a bad person. It is something that they happen to get because they were exposed to someone else and they happen to be susceptible at that time. And I certainly would hope, as you mentioned earlier, Raji, that they found the cure at Carville. They found it, they were trialing it back in the 1940s. So we've had it for a long time. It's not necessarily an easy treatment. It takes actually several years, a couple of antibiotics for several years, but it is so within our reach, right, to, I would say, end this disease forever. And a lot of it is, I think, recommitting. So I would love to see the WHO, for example, recommit to curing this disease, because although, maybe the incidence isn't as high as some other diseases, certainly in the United States, we only have a handful of cases, a couple hundred every year, but in other places, India, Brazil, Indonesia, you're talking about 100 to 200,000 cases, new cases every year. That's significant. But also, I think the lifelong results of the disease, the blindness, the way that people can, lose the use of some of their limbs, lose sensation, like these things carry with them for their entire lives. So there's so much that you can do, I think, to stop that from escalating. And so I would like to see one, again, like a recommitment to really treating these people hand in hand with, again, that education, so we can really dismantle the stigma that keeps a lot of people from seeking care initially.
Thank you. So I see people are typing in lots of questions. My final questions before I read out the questions from the audience. What are your hopes for this book? And what are you working on now?
I would say my hope for this book, we talked about COVID, and certainly I think there are similarities, but it's not the only incidents in recent history where that's been the case. I think about HIV and the way that people reacted to that disease, again, with so much fear, but also a lot of prejudice and stigma in the early days in the 80s. There's still stigma around mental health and body size and other things like that. And so my hope for people who read the book, I think it's twofold. One, just that we're all a little bit more mindful of the way that we can conflate these two things, right? Something that is just a disease, just a bacteria, just a virus, and yet these ideas about a person's worth and their value. But then secondly, I really hope that readers, again, that they see the hope that is there, that yes, the history of Carville it's a tragic history, and what these people endured was terrible, but yet they still did thrive. They still found ways to make their lives beautiful. And I think that we can, with our own challenges, do the same thing as well. So that would be my hope for the book, this book. And then what I'm working on next, I'm writing a new book set in 1900 about a woman physician who is on the verge of ruin, and she joins a snake oil salesman and his traveling medicine show. Yes, so she's kind of lost all faith in herself and her ability to practice medicine, but through her experiences, as they travel around the country, hawking all these cure-alls and fake potions, she really begins to find a way to believe in herself again and real medicine.
That sounds great. Wonderful. Well, let me turn to the audience questions in the chat. So Bonnie, Sunita commented that Melanie was a simpleton and she loved Scarlet. There you go. Bonnie asks, how is it that there are still cases of Hansen's disease in the US?
So a couple of reasons. One, some are cases that are brought over from abroad. One of the interesting things about the disease, so unlike, COVID, right? You are exposed to someone with the disease, and within the next let's call it 3 to 14 days, that's when you are likely to either develop the disease or not yourself. They call that the incubation period. And for Hansen's disease, that incubation period, the time from when you were exposed to when you might actually show symptoms of the disease, can be incredibly long, months to years. And so for that reason, it's not as easy to be able to go back and say, okay, this person has the disease and who else did they spread it to? Again, because so much time has gone by. So that's one of the reasons. But people who do have the disease, they're treated outpatient now. They can go through the public health department and get the medicines they need. And this I think is a small reason, but they have found that some armadillos also carry Hansen's disease. And so people, again, I don't want to scare anyone, but they do recommend that you not get super close to armadillos for that reason.
Right. I mean, this whole fascinating business of zoonotic viruses, leaping, or bacteria leaping from animals to humans, as we're kind of now trying to figure out with COVID-19, where did it come from?
Yeah.
So one of the interesting things about the disease is that, first in the long incubation period, because of that, the difficulty in doing contact tracing, which is so immensely helpful. And so it seemed as though, in the case of Mirielle, it was like, maybe for most people, they lose sensation because of the infection. And then when, there's harm to that particular body part, they realize what's going on. And is it true that, most people are naturally resistant to it, but some are susceptible for genetic reasons or something?
Yes. So they say about 95% of people are immune to the disease. You would come in contact with someone with the disease and you would never contract it yourself. But there is a very small percentage of people who for genetic reasons, or it just could be also situational. So a particular, perhaps they're experiencing a short-term lull in their immunity, for example, or their immune health, that they could at that time be susceptible to the disease. And yeah, so it's not, I think that was one of my misconceptions, that it was this incredibly contagious disease, and that again, like you had mentioned, that you with the hands, like I thought this is something that was a skin disease, but really it's a nerve disease primarily. That's what it was. It's one of the big things that the disease affects, and a lot of the things that we associate with the disease are secondary to that nerve damage.
That's right. And I guess that's what kind of instills all this fear, that you see somebody for, entirely different reasons, who may have lost a finger or something. And you think, oh my God, this is going to happen to me immediately. And, that really causes a lot of this fear and stigma. So Bonnie also asks, how did you choose the name Mirielle? It isn't a common name.
No, it's not. I chose the name, actually, so I do this with many of my characters, but I had a really good friend in high school growing up. She's actually nothing like Mirielle in the book, but I loved the name, and my fondness for her, for those two reasons, is why I picked that name.
Thank you. Let's see. So Carol notes that one character was negative for 12 consecutive months. And in fact, at Carville, you kind of had, if you managed to test negative for 12 consecutive months, then you were considered to be okay, and you could rejoin the outside world. And she also asks, was it common that there really was no going home? And I think that's related more to the stigma and the reaction of family members.
Yeah, I think certainly you had instances where people, they would get their 12 negative tests. So each month they would do a skin scraping, they would call it, and they would look for the bacteria under the microscope. And if you went 12 straight months where they couldn't find the bacteria, they would declare you like you're no longer a menace to the public health, and they'd give you this certificate and you could go back out into the world. And some people had families, waiting there with open arms, and some people had families who said, I I don't want you to come back. Because again, just because you've got this piece of paper, just because they're saying you're not contagious, that doesn't mean that the stigma vanishes. You also had people who eventually did get their 12 negative tests, but they had been at the facility for so long that they really didn't feel comfortable in the outside world. And so they would stay as well. But I will say that for many, many patients, they didn't get to the 12 negative tests. Mm-hmm. That was its own very high barrier to leave.
Right.
Because
right.
Again, yeah, we didn't have a cure at that point, right? So there wasn't much by way of meaningful treatment for them. So getting to that point where they couldn't detect the bacteria was really hard.
Right, and it was fascinating to read about, all the you did such an amazing job of bringing to life the work in the clinics, the clinical trials, the studies that were ongoing. They were trying so many different things. And Mirielle, to her credit, part of her growth is to recognize that there is only one way out of here, and that's to find a cure. I'm going to try to help find one. Yeah. And that was really inspiring and, kind of heartwarming that she went down that path, because we know, many of us in the healthcare business know that, sometimes clinical trials are care. Mm-hmm. When there is no cure, those, are the way to either get help yourself or to make sure that others can benefit.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's see. Rupal is delighted that you're here. What a great writer indeed. Mm-hmm. Sarah says, you mentioned that patients of different races were fairly integrated. What about the racial background of the doctors and nurses and caregivers? Were the caregivers mostly Black women?
No. So from what I can tell from pictures, I will say that's when I did my research at Carville, most of the caregivers, they were the sisters from the Daughters of Charity, and most of those women were white. And interestingly too, of course, they were all Catholic, and that created its own tensions there at the facility, because you had a lot of patients who were not Catholic and felt sometimes that the sisters could be a little proselytizing. But, so most of both, I would say, the caregivers and the physicians were white, but at the same time, you did have people from the surrounding community. So the area around Louisiana, that part of Louisiana, that would come and do like maintenance work and sort of the upkeep on the facility. Working in the kitchen and things like that, and there were a number of Black workers doing those jobs.
Mm-hmm. I see. Let's see here. Yeah, so Kathy asks, I'm wondering where Mirielle would have been exposed to Hansen's disease in LA. So would it be like, LA being a place to and from which people travel, or what's your thinking?
Yeah, so I think it could have come in a number of ways. An interesting thing about the disease is that it's spread by, they believe, they're not even 100% sure, scientists, how it is spread, but the belief is that it's spread by respiratory droplets, similar to like influenza, the flu. Wow. Not, I always thought it would be something that you would like get from touching something that someone with the disease touched, but that's not the case, at least insofar as we know. So in terms of Mirielle, and I leave that a little bit vague because I wanted to highlight the fact that, again, there was this incredibly long incubation period, and a lot of people didn't know where they had contracted the disease. So for Mirielle, it could have been some of the people that she had, come in contact with, both, at her home, right? Because that being so wealthy, there were all kinds of people that they had brought in to, they had a cook, they had a nanny, they had all of these, people coming in and out of the house. Certainly, she was also, they were going out and, around a lot of other people, just with her husband's work. So I think there were many possibilities where she could have had that exposure and picked up the disease. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. No, it's Absolutely fascinating. So Rupal asks, this is about the name. Patients at Carville fought for decades to promote the name Hansen's disease. What power did language hold in erasing stigma? Now, this is interesting. I also wanted to ask you that, so while it is referred to as Hansen's disease in many forums and by many organizations, the Centers for Disease Control continue to call it leprosy, right? And I wondered, so Rupal's question, as well as why is leprosy retained as kind of the formal disease name in some of these quarters?
So I believe that the CDC calls it Hansen's disease. I think it's the WHO that continues to call it.
Okay.
But that's a small distinction. And I think that's a great point that there is so much, weight and power, right? There's so much power in words. And so that of course was what drove them to want to change the name. But at the same time, I think that it is difficult because people are trying to talk about the same things, right? And so it becomes difficult if I'm talking about Hansen's disease and no one knows what Hansen's disease is, then all of the things I'm trying to tell you about Hansen's disease, about leprosy, no one is understanding. And so I think that's part of the reason that the WHO has not yet taken on Hansen's disease, that we're still, I think we're still in the process of adapting to that new name and sort of spreading that, and that hopefully we will get there.
Right. And Hansen was this Norwegian scientist, physician who actually discovered the bacterium that causes leprosy. So, yeah, it was interesting. Yeah. So Deepka says it was an educating and enlightening session. She learned a lot. And she has a question. In the book Hawaii, James Michener talks about two kinds of leprosy. One is infectious by touch and one is not. Actually, don't recall this, but you may know about the different kinds.
So there are two. The bacteria are the same. The causative agent are the same. And to my knowledge, the transmission is the same, but the manifestation in the body is different. One is more, you see it more in the nerves. You see it in like the loss of sensation. The actual way that it will manifest on the skin is a little bit different. The nodules will look different. And then you have another type of the disease that does appear more pronounced. And that's where you'll see more of like the raised nodules on the skin. And they're actually the type of leprosy. Again, it's the same bacteria, but the way that it is expressed, that actually changes the way that you treat it. They'll treat sometimes they call it lepromatous type of leprosy. They'll treat that longer and with an added antibiotic.
Mm-hmm. Wow. Yeah. And you'd mentioned that it's like a 2-year regimen. It's an incredibly long treatment regimen, right?
Yeah.
Well, so we are coming to the end of our hour together. Reed says, thanks to everyone for joining us. The video will be available soon at siliconvalleyreads.org under media. Barbara also says, thank you. Carol loved this historical fiction so much. She's read The Undertaker's Assistant and already have to read, have to read Next Between Earth and Sky. So a huge thank you to Amanda Skenandore, and thank you to all attendees. Reed, thank you for bringing us together, and Deepka for your support. Thank you all. Stay safe and have a good evening.
Thank you everyone so much. It's really been a pleasure to be here, and I absolutely echo thank you to Reed at Silicon Valley Reads. It's an incredible honor to be part of this event. Thank you so much, Raji, for the wonderful questions, Deepka, and the whole Indian business and professional women. It's been really wonderful. Thank you.
Lovely. Thank you all so much. Have a great evening. Bye-bye.